Sarah Hayes heard the leak before she found it. A thin, wet hiss working out of Brody's chest, while 82mm rounds walked the landing zone and kicked mud over the skids of the grounded bird. In trauma surgery, rank meant nothing. A hole in a lung was still a hole in a lung. He was drowning on dry land, mouth opening and closing against blood and foam. One eye rolled white with pain. Every breath bought him less time. Jenkins was on the other side of him with both hands clamped over a dressing that had already gone black. He kept saying they were not cleared for an open procedure this far forward. Not with incoming that close. Not with command trying to clear the pad for whatever still had a chance of flying. Sarah did not bother answering. She shoved her knee into the sludge beside Brody's ribs, leaned close enough to smell fresh iron and propellant, and found the second intercostal space, by touch, through shredded fabric, slick skin, and the kind of panic that made other people stupid. The ground jumped under her when the next shell hit. Mud spattered her cheek. Something hot and metallic rang off the fuselage behind them. Sarah drove the 14-gauge needle down and in. Hard. One clean, committed motion with no room for second thoughts, and felt the instant it punched through. There was a nasty little give. Then a pop, sharp and final through her glove. Compressed air ripped out of Brody's chest in a savage hiss, high and tearing, like somebody had slit open a steam line. A fine spray of blood blew up with it and dotted her protective lenses red. Brody bucked once. Jenkins made a noise that was almost a prayer and almost vomiting. Sarah held the catheter steady, counted his breaths, watched the wild flutter at his throat lose some of its chaos, and kept one hand pressed flat against his sternum as if she could bully his body back into the habit of living. The human body of a grown man carries about 5 liters of blood, she said, more to the air than to him. You're being irresponsible with yours. It was dry, mean, exactly steady enough to keep Jenkins from coming apart. Brody dragged in a breath that sounded ugly but useful. Then another. Colour crawled back into his mouth by degrees. The monitor clipped to his kit found a rhythm again and stumbled upward from the edge of nowhere. Sarah cut away more of his shirt, checked for the rest of the damage, and forced herself not to hurry. Hurry was how people nicked an artery, missed a bleed, killed a man they had already saved. Around them, the landing zone had gone half-blind with smoke and rotor wash grit, medics and loaders moving bent at the waist between stretchers. Ammo cans, bodies, and burning scraps of nylon. Jenkins was shaking now, really shaking, his hands smeared red to the wrists. Sarah took a pressure dressing from him, planted it where it needed to be, and told him to squeeze until his fingers cramped. He obeyed because her voice left no room for anything else. Another shell came in close enough to slap a wave of heat across the mud. Nobody looked up. Looking up never helped. She tasted cordite in the back of her throat and felt her own pulse sitting calm and narrow in her neck. The old trick of turning terror into a checklist. Brody's chest still hitched, but it moved. That was enough for the next 30 seconds. In this place, 30 seconds was a luxury item. The radio on Brody's vest crackled under her forearm, drowned first in static, then clawed its way into words. A man's voice came through ragged and too loud, the sound of somebody trying not to die, while other people were already busy with the job Echo 7 calling. We've been set up. Ammo is black. Does anybody copy? The words hit Brody harder than the blood loss had. His fingers twitched for the handset. Sarah got there first, lifted it clear of the slick plate carrier, and listened while the signal broke. Returned. Broke again. Gunfire snapped faint through the transmission. Somebody in the background was screaming for a tourniquet. Somebody else was reciting grid numbers like prayer beads. Sarah looked toward the command bunker through the smoke, toward the neat little boxes where officers turned living men into delays and procedures. Brody's pulse was stronger under her fingers now. Strong enough to leave. Strong enough to hear his team dying in pieces. She handed Jenkins the fluids, told him to keep Brody breathing and keep him off her runway, then rose from the mud in one motion. The decision settled into place before she had even named it. Cold, certain, and already halfway illegal. Brody's radio was still hissing in her head when Sarah stepped through the bunker entrance and into the colder air of command. It smelled like wet canvas, burned coffee, and men who had not touched the front line all night. She heard Sterling before she saw him. His voice carried the clean, smooth weight of a clerk reading out shipping delays. Not a man deciding who got to live long enough to see dawn, hold position. No lift assets until further notice. A pause. Then the line that mattered: magnetic storm interference makes takeoff unsafe. Captain! That is procedure, he said it politely. Sociopathically polite. That was the ugliest part. Sarah did not slow down. She passed the open door, caught a glimpse of him with one hand on a headset and the other checking his watch. Uniform pressed. Boots clean. Not one stripe of mud on him from the pad outside. She kept walking. Men like Sterling fed on argument. Paperwork had always been their native language. She preferred systems that bled when you cut them. The bedside EMR station in the treatment alcove woke under her touch with a hard blue glow. Her gloves left red smears on the keys. The keyboard answered with cold little clicks, neat and sterile, almost offended by the state of her hands. A warning box jumped onto the screen before the chart loaded. Federal audit sync pending. 0600. She stared at it for one beat too long. That clean, bureaucratic phrase landing wrong in the middle of a night like this. Not urgent enough to panic over. Not harmless enough to ignore. She hit dismiss. The chart tree opened. Camera icon, top right. Corridor coverage grid. Staff location pings. The base believed what its machines told it. Fine. She asked for a black tag and listened to the printer chatter out the card with the same calm certainty it would have used for morphine orders or meal counts. Expectant. Minimal intervention. Someone already sorted for dying. She took the tag, crossed to a dead monitor tucked in a blind patch where the camera angle clipped the corner, and slapped it over the broken glass with blood-wet fingers. From the lens above, it would read like a doctor standing fixed beside a hopeless body. Good enough. Cameras were lazy. Bureaucracy was lazier. She went back through the supply corridor without haste, because haste attracted eyes. Jenkins barreled past at the far end with a tray he nearly dropped, face white, panic rolling off him in waves. He did not even look at her. Good. Sarah reached the locked cage at the rear of medical logistics and pulled the trauma shears from her pocket. They made their familiar little click when she opened and closed them once. A habit. A metronome. A private promise to herself. The padlock was cheap. Base issue. Plated steel, pretending to be stronger than it was. She jammed one blade into the housing and torqued hard. Metal shrieked. She shifted angle, hit it again, then leaned her whole weight through the handles. Something gave at last with a dry, ugly snap, harder and meaner at the end of the sentence than the metal deserved. The sound carried down the hall like a bone breaking. She froze and listened. Nothing but distant shouting. The cough of generators. Another muffled line of radio traffic from command. She pulled the ruined lock free, set it down gently out of reflex, and opened the cage. Inside sat the M200 intervention, confiscated from a dead scout and waiting for CID transfer, long and obscene and heavier than any sane person would want in mountain fog, along with the ammunition she needed and the price she would pay later. By the time she slung the rifle and shouldered the extra weight, her right trap had already begun to knot. 60 pounds of problem settled across her spine. The strap bit through wet fabric and bruised muscle that had never fully forgiven old work. She took the bolt, the ammo, a compact medkit, and nothing else. Too much gear got people killed. Too little got them killed faster. On her way back out, she passed the command room again. Sterling was still talking in that level administrative murmur, probably writing a death sentence in verbs like delay, reroute, hold. Sarah did not give him the satisfaction of a look. Outside, the fog had thickened over the base perimeter until the floodlights just turned it white and blind. She stepped into it with the rifle dragging at her shoulder, boots sinking into the slick edge of the road, and felt the cameras lose her exactly the way she intended. Behind her, the broken lock lay in 2 pieces on the concrete. Ahead of her, Echo 7 was somewhere in that murk, with empty magazines and no rescue bird coming. Sterling had chosen procedure. Sarah chose the grey zone and kept walking. The climb started where the road gave up, and the mountain decided it had better things to do than help. Sarah went up anyway, boots slipping on wet shale, the M200 dragging at her right shoulder until the whole joint felt packed with hot glass. 60 pounds did not sound like much when it lived on a form and requisition line. 60 pounds at 3 a.m, with cold fog licking the rock and old bruises waking up one by one, was another religion. Her trap had gone from tight to mean an hour ago, and now the ache sat deep in the socket itself, a hard drilling pain that made her fingers tingle if she shifted wrong. She kept climbing. Echo 7's last transmission had left a shape in her head she could not set down. Empty magazines, bad cover, men talking too loud because the dead were already close enough to hear. Halfway up Kilo Ridge, she had to stop and lean her forehead against the stone, breath steaming into the fog. Rifle slings soaring into muscle that had already been punished twice tonight. Different terrain, she told herself quietly. Voice flat as paper, same physics problem. Then she pushed off the rock and kept going, because pain was expensive, but not as expensive as time. At the top, the world narrowed to wet stone, white vapour, and gunfire somewhere below and left. She bellied down behind a slab of granite, eased the rifle forward, and brought the FLIR up. The display bloomed in dull gradients first, then sharpened into broken heat. Rock stayed dead black. Brush held a little cold ghost of the day. Men showed up as smears of red and yellow moving through grey, all of them blurred at the edges by fog that rolled and tore and stitched itself back together. That was the problem. The mountain gave her windows, not sightlines. 7 seconds at best when the mist thinned and the gully opened enough to make a shot honest. 7 seconds. Then white again. She found Echo 7 where they had been pinned under a shelf of fractured stone, one body not moving, one firing in short bursts, one dragging another by the back of his rig. Across from them, higher on the opposite lip, the enemy gunner glowed brightest at the core, weapon hot, shoulders steady, working the kill zone with the patience of a man who thought the night belonged to him. Sarah tracked the image down instead of up. Not the head. Too small. Too much like gambling. She watched the near shoulder, the axilla, that bright knot where vessels, nerves, and confidence crowded too close together. The fog parted. Her 7 seconds began. She settled the stock and nearly blacked out from the jolt in her shoulder. The pain came fast and white, clean enough to be insulting. Her cheek found the comb anyway. She tasted old salt at the corner of her mouth and let her breathing flatten. One slow inhale, half out. Hold. The ridge had its own pulse under her, a faint tremor from distant rounds rolling through the stone. But she ignored that and listened to the one in her own throat. It tapped there against her collar, steady and inconveniently human. Sarah counted it like she had counted drips and shrinking pupils, all the little metronomes between life and the floor. On the FLIR screen, the gunner shifted, bringing that hot red seam under the arm clear for half a heartbeat. More than enough if she did not get greedy. She waited through systole, waited the extra slice she trusted more than instinct. That ugly practice lag after the beat, 4/10 that let the body stop shoving itself around. Then she pressed. The rifle went off like the mountain had cracked open. Recoil slammed her bruised shoulder so hard sparks danced at the edge of her vision. Down below, the bright shape on the screen jerked sideways. Not a collapse. Not movie nonsense. Just sudden ruin. The arm on the weapon dropped dead and useless. The muzzle swung wild and stitched rounds into empty rock while the man turned in a circle, confused by his own missing limb. Echo 7 moved before the echo finished bouncing through the ravine. One of them broke left. Another surged uphill. And the whole trapped shape of the fight changed in 3 seconds flat. That was all they had needed. Not a miracle. A gap. Sarah worked the bolt with stiff fingers and kept the sightline covered. Shoulder screaming now. Right side numb and burning. Below, the enemy gunner folded at last under his own bad wiring and the collapse of his position. Another heat signature tried to drag him, then thought better of it and disappeared into the fog. Echo 7 slid out of the kill pocket and into broken cover farther west. Alive, because one man had lost the use of an arm at the wrong time. Sarah let out the breath she had been holding since the shot and found her hand shaking a little from pain, not nerves. She checked the ridge around her, took one last sweep through the FLIR, then began stripping out what she had touched. Brass. Prints in the mud where she could scuff them. A wrapper from clotting gauze. The roll itself had come loose from her kit during the climb. One blood-marked turn of white against the dark rock. She looked at it for a second and left it there. Too much movement to chase it. Down in the ravine, men were still running for their lives. Behind her, the mountain kept the crack of the shot and gave nothing back. The ICU had the wrong kind of quiet, the kind built out of machines doing all the talking people were too scared to do themselves. Sarah came through the west doors with the mountain still in her bones, shoulder half dead from recoil and cold, clothes stiff with dried mud and somebody else's blood. The fluorescent light made everything look meaner than daylight would have. Echo 7 was spread across 2 bays and 1 overflow table, all of them pale under the lamps, gear cut open, bodies reduced to wounds and numbers. Brody lasted maybe 40 seconds before the monitor turned ugly. His pressure dropped in a straight, nasty slide. A thin alarm started whining, then built into a shrill, steady cry that needled through the room and into the base of Sarah's skull. Jenkins was at the leg wound, hands slippery, eyes wide enough to show a clean ring of white. "Pressure's gone," he said, which was not useful, but at least it was true. Sarah was already moving. "Clamp the bleed," she snapped. His shredded leg as a distraction. She did not raise her voice. She was at Brody's chest before the sentence finished, leaving her mouth, gloves changed, drape shoved aside, body leaning in over the cavity, while the smell of isopropyl alcohol tangled with hot blood and the copper stink of opened flesh. There are moments in surgery when the world narrows so hard it feels rude. This was one of them. The chest was filling faster than suction could clear it, dark sheets of blood welling up and swallowing landmarks. Sarah shoved one hand in anyway, deep and blind, fingers slipping through warmth and slick tissue until her wrist vanished into the opening. No lecture, no clean anatomy poster in her head, just pressure, texture, and memory in her fingertips from too many nights like this. Brody's heart hammered against the heel of her hand like an animal trapped in a box. Somewhere left and down. Too much blood. Somewhere farther back, a vessel still pumping into the cavity. She swept, felt rib, clot, lung edge, then found the source in a hot, twitching jump under her middle finger. Artery. Angry and alive. She pinched hard, shifted angle, pinched again until the pressure changed and the flood eased from torrent to spill. There, she said, mostly to herself. Jenkins was breathing like he had run a mile in a gas mask. Another medic passed a clamp into her free hand. Sarah set it by feel, and only then looked up. The monitor was still bad, but no longer falling through the floor. She reached deeper, working along the wound track, and felt something hard where flesh should have given. Metal, lodged ugly and deep. She drew the bullet out with forceps and 2 fingers, slow because fast dropped things. It came free in a red slick line and hit the stainless tray with a cold, sharp clink that cut through the room harder than the alarms had. Everybody heard it. Sarah heard it too, and hated how familiar the sound was. Steel core armor piercing by the weight of it, though she did not say that part yet. She tossed a look at Jenkins. He was still compressing the leg, jaw shaking, trying not to fold. "Stay on it," she said. "If he dies after all this, I'm billing you personally." That got the faintest twitch out of him. Not a smile, just the memory of one. Good. She crossed to the side counter, ran saline over the bullet first, then a little alcohol, rolling it between gauze and gloved fingertips while water pinked and dripped into the basin. The room behind her stayed busy in the clipped way people moved when they knew panic would only waste oxygen. Sarah bent the lamp lower. Light pooled bright over the tray. The bullet turned under it, copper jacket peeled back in one place, steel heart showing through. She studied the deformation and the beveling around the jacket the way other people might study a signature. Entry angle. Spin. Resistance on impact. None of it lived where it should have for stray fire. This had come in clean. Deliberate. Then she saw the mark. Not on the nose, not where damage had mangled it, but tucked into the cleaner curve near the base where the jacket still held. Tiny stamped characters. Lot code. Internal production trace. She lowered her face until the lamp glare slid off and the numbers came clear enough to read. For 1 second she thought exhaustion was playing tricks, that her shoulder pain and the climb and the recoil had finally started bending straight lines. Then she read it again. Same result. Base inventory lot. Not enemy supply. Not battlefield salvage. One of theirs. Something cold and dry moved through her chest, not shock exactly, more the feeling of a lock turning somewhere behind a wall. The ambush on Echo 7 had not been chance. It had been orchestrated, and Echo 7 had clearly found something it was never supposed to find: stolen medical tech, stripped supplies, the kind of theft big enough to need witnesses buried with the paperwork. Sarah set the bullet back in the tray and listened to the tiny ring it made against steel. Behind her, monitors kept up their endless complaints. Brody was still alive. Barely, but alive. Jenkins looked at her from across the table, waiting for the next order, not yet knowing the room had changed shape around them. The worst part was not betrayal. Men had always been cheap. The worst part was how cleanly this one had been filed. Sarah kept the bullet in the tray beside Brody's bed, where she could see it without looking at it. The lock code sat in her peripheral vision like a toothache. Her gloves were still tacky with dried blood, and the room had begun to settle into that ugly after-surge lull where bodies either stabilized or quietly gave up. That was when her own body remembered what she had done to it. The adrenaline drained out all at once. Her hands started shaking so hard the ambu bag pulsed crooked in her grip. She locked her left hand around it anyway and forced a rhythm into Brody's lungs, Squeeze and release, squeeze and release, forearm burning, shoulder throbbing, palm cramping around the bag while the green trace on the bedside screen hopped like it had someplace better to be. With her right index finger, she reached for the terminal, missed the first icon, swore under her breath, and tried again. The muscles in her forearm were jumping on their own now, nasty little betrayals she could not talk down. "Stay with me," Jenkins said, though he was not talking to Brody. Sarah gave him a flat look that shut him up, and leaned closer to the screen, one hand breathing for a man, the other hunting through the system that might explain why one of their bullets had come home through his chest. The password prompt rose in sterile blue light. She typed fast, got one character wrong because her thumb twitched sideways, and the terminal kicked the login back at her with bureaucratic patience. Invalid credentials. For a second, she wanted to put her fist through the display. Instead, she breathed once through her nose, tasted blood and alcohol in the back of her throat, and started over. Left hand compress. Release. Compress. Her shoulder throbbed with every movement from the climb and the shot and the surgery piled on top of each other like bad debt. The second login took. She fed the lot number into a supply query field, buried 3 menus deep, then pulled up the audit trail with the side of her hand because her fingertips were too unsteady to trust. Data crawled across the screen in neat columns, shipment paths, custody signatures, timestamps, every clean little administrative lie that let war pretend it was organized. Then the name landed in the center row and held there. Major Nathan Sterling. Electronic release authorization. 3 days earlier. Sarah stared at it until the letters stopped being letters and became a shape she recognized on sight. She had heard his voice refuse a bird. She had watched him hide behind procedure. Now the machine put his name on the ammunition. When his name sat there under the audit trail, the motive finally locked in place. Echo 7 had stumbled onto the theft, medical tech and supply diversion, dressed up as logistics noise, and Sterling was burying the witnesses before the ledger could talk. Brody coughed against the tube. Sarah squeezed the bag harder and kept reading, pulse cutting slow in her throat. 100 yards away, Sterling's office stayed dim except for the desk monitor and the strip light over the map board. He had loosened his collar, not enough to look human. One hand rested on a mug gone cold. The other moved through open files with the same neat economy he brought to every order he gave. When the alert hit, it took over the screen in a red block that made the room look briefly arterial. Intrusion alert, ICU Terminal 4. Sterling did not flinch. That would have required surprise, and men like him only ever feared inconvenience. He set the mug down, read the line once, then once more, eyes narrowing not from confusion but calculation. Terminal 4. Intensive Care West Wing. Restricted Procurement Auditory. He knew what lived inside that path. He knew who had reason to touch it tonight. The corners of his mouth moved a fraction, not quite anger, not quite satisfaction. More like a puzzle piece seating itself where he had expected it all along. He tapped 2 keys, pulled up the linked access log, and watched Sarah Hayes announce herself to the system she was never supposed to interrogate. Somewhere outside his office, generators hummed and boots crossed polished concrete. Sterling lifted the handset without hurry. Quiet men were worse. Shouting wasted energy. Logistics won wars. Logistics also buried them. Back in the ICU, Sarah saw the search tree freeze for half a beat, then refresh with a small authentication echo she did not remember triggering. That was enough. Systems did not hesitate unless they were talking to somebody else. Cold anger moved through her so cleanly, it almost steadied her hands. Almost. She kept the ambu bag working, felt Brody's lungs push back, and copied the release line into memory because she no longer trusted the screen to remain hers. Sterling. 3 days. Internal issue. AP. No guesswork left. She had found the hand behind the paperwork, and the paperwork had found her back. Jenkins leaned in and saw something in her face that made him stop asking questions. The ventilator beside them chirped. Another monitor gave a warning flutter. The bullet lay in the tray under the lamp, small and suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. Sarah cleared the query window, but not fast enough to believe she had hidden the trail. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened with the hush of good hinges. Then a second sound came through the walls, too faint for Jenkins to catch, and too deliberate for her to mistake. Not an alarm. Not yet. Just the first shift in the building's posture, like a man taking off his watch before a fight. Sarah set the ambu bag into a steady cadence and looked toward the darkened hallway. The trap had closed from both ends, and now at least she knew whose fingers had pulled the wire. The power died with a single heavy thump that Sarah felt in her feet before she heard it in her ears. Then came the dropout hush, followed by the abrupt electronic complaints of 4 ventilators losing wall current all at once. One instant. The West Wing ICU was washed in dirty fluorescent white. Every stain, fingerprint, and drying blood splash laid open. The next, the overheads cut out, and the room dropped through a beat of black into the submerged red of emergency lamps. The colour hit the walls and made the whole unit look butchered. 4 ventilators answered the transfer with sharp, panicked runs of beeps before each machine settled into battery mode. Backup runtime flashed in red numerals on 2 displays. Then all 4 after the system caught up, 45 minutes. Sarah did the math without meaning to. 45 minutes of borrowed breath for men who could not negotiate for themselves. Jenkins jerked around so fast he slammed a tray with his hip and sent clamps rattling. Somebody in the far bay whimpered behind an oxygen mask. Sarah was already moving. She crossed to the first vent, killed the audible alarm, moved to the second, killed that one too, then the third and fourth. Her hands fast now for a different reason than before. She needed the room quiet. Quiet enough to hear what came next. Machines were honest, but they were terrible at staying alive. People were worse. The red light was low and mean, just enough to turn edges uncertain. Sarah paused between beds and listened. No shouted response from maintenance. No overhead page. No scramble of orderlies. That told her more than any announcement would have. This was not a random outage, and it sure as hell was not a drill. Down the hall came the thin squeak of rubber wheels, and beneath it something harder, a controlled scrape in measured intervals. Tactical soles on linoleum. Not nurses, not corpsmen, not men trying to help. She stepped to the glass doors at the head of the unit and looked through the narrow wired panel. 3 shapes moved under the red spill of the corridor lights, bulky in pale hazmat suits, pushing a waste cart draped with biohazard bags. Too smooth, too balanced. The cart was theatre. So were the suits. Real clean-up crews never moved like they expected gunfire. These did. One man's head turned a fraction, and she caught the short, dark geometry under the hood where a respirator should have sat loose. Earpiece. The lead pair of boots stopped exactly short of the threshold, then shifted, quiet little test steps, feeling the floor, checking reflection angles on the glass. Predators at a blind. Sarah's mouth went dry and then flattened back into control. 45 minutes on battery. 3 armed hunters. No gun. Jenkins had heard the wheels by then. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered. Because fear makes idiots think whispers are invisible. Sarah did not answer him at first. She was scanning the room instead, not for salvation, just options. Crash cart, stainless poles, oxygen lines, sharps bins, a pair of soft restraints. One set of issue handcuffs hanging from the belt she had never bothered to remove after intake duty. The main doors to the ICU opened inward. Thick glass. Good latch. Better if they stayed that way. She pulled the cuffs free, crossed to the entrance, and slipped one bracelet through the paired pull handles before Jenkins had even understood what he was watching. The ratchet clicked loud in the hush, a dry mechanical bite. She cinched the second loop tight through the chain and locked the door in place with the cheap, ugly certainty of prison hardware. No dramatic flourish. Just a decision made fast enough to matter. Jenkins stared at her like she had lost her mind. Maybe she had. Maybe losing it was just another phrase people used when a choice scared them. Outside, the cart resumed its slow roll, and stopped within arm's reach of the glass. No one knocked. No one announced quarantine. The nearest hazmat figure tilted his head, as if listening to the machines she had already silenced. That was how pros did it. They let you feel their patience first. Sarah backed away from the doors one step at a time, keeping the unit in view and the corridor panel in her peripheral vision. The emergency lights painted everyone raw and artificial, skin tones gone to rust and wax. Brody's chest rose under battery power and old luck. Across the room, one of Echo 7's men bucked weakly against sedation, caught in whatever ditch his brain was dying in. Jenkins moved toward the door, as if he meant to protest, then saw the shapes beyond the glass more clearly, and stopped with both hands half raised. Good. Learning had finally entered the building. The wheels outside gave a soft quarter turn. A gloved hand touched the handle and found it dead. No shove followed. No angry burst of force. Just stillness. Then the whisper of somebody shifting weight from heel to toe. Assassins, not raiders. Sarah could work with that. Noise would have been easier and worse. Silence meant planning time, but not much. She took one last sweep of the room, counting patients, counting vents, counting distances between metal and glass, trying to turn a hospital back into terrain. Behind her ribs, the cold anger from Sterling's audit trap had hardened into something leaner. The hospital was a battlefield now. No speech made it so. No banner, just red light, battery clocks draining toward zero, and killers waiting outside a locked door she had chosen to seal with herself on the wrong side of it. The first sound was not the cutter. It was the little testing scrape before it, metal touching metal, while somebody on the far side of the glass confirmed what kind of restraint she had used. Then came the bite, a short, hard crunch. Another, and the handcuff chain at the main doors gave way with a flat snapping noise that seemed too small for what it meant. Sarah was already moving before the broken cuff hit the floor. She had no gun, no clean line of retreat, and 4 ventilators chewing through battery behind her like hungry clocks. The supply corridor off the ICU was narrow, red-lit, lined with steel shelving, mop buckets, waste bins, and enough smooth floor to break a neck if you got careless. That made it useful. She grabbed a liter bag of normal saline from an open crash cart, thumbed the seam with a scalpel, and slashed it wide. Cold fluid sheeted out over the linoleum and raced along the baseboard, thin at first, then pooling under the emergency light. The floor went slick in a hurry. She dragged the AED off the wall mount and tucked herself into the blind corner where the corridor jogged left. Her shoulder barked at the movement. Her right hand had not fully stopped shaking from the adrenaline crash, but the shakes had narrowed now into something meaner and more useful. The silent one entered through the rear access, not the main doors. Of course he did. Professionals hated obvious routes. Sarah saw the first slice of him in the reflection off a cabinet door. Pale hazmat fabric ghosting into view, bulked shoulders, compact stride, head tilted slightly to listen before committing weight. He carried bolt cutters low in one hand and a suppressed weapon in the other, muzzle down, patient, disciplined. He moved through the corridor like the hospital already belonged to him. The saline had spread farther than she expected, the slick edge reaching into the darker section near the housekeeping alcove. Good. The man paused once to check the floor with his eyes, not his foot, then stepped anyway because in the red light it looked like reflected glow and nothing more. One boot landed, then the other. The soles squeaked a fraction on the wet tile. Sarah felt the room tighten. The AED hummed against her knee as it woke. She set the paddles down near the edge of the pool and heard the charge tone start low and climb. The assassin turned his head toward it. Tolat. Sarah moved out of cover on the half-beat between his recognition and his reaction, dropped to one knee, pressed both paddles against the flooded floor at the margin of his stance, and said, the one word she had said over bodies, over chaos, over too many ragged hearts trying to quit. Clear. The discharge came as light before it became motion. A white snap jumped across the wet floor with a sound like frying wire. The corridor flashed. Ozone punched into the back of Sarah's nose, hot and bitter, a storm smell trapped indoors. The man convulsed so hard it looked like invisible hooks had yanked him off the earth. Armored muscle and bad intentions lifted ugly, shoulders slamming into the wall, weapon hand blown open as his grip failed. The suppressed gun skittered away beneath a linen cart. His body came down sideways, boot sliding out under him on the saline-slicked tile, helmet cracking the baseboard with a dead, solid knock. For a second he kept jerking in little aftershocks. Then he went still, except for one boot heel twitching against the floor. Sarah stayed where she was long enough to make sure still meant still. The smell of ozone thickened with burnt fabric and fresh saline. Somewhere behind her, a ventilator changed tone. A battery warning hidden under the rest of the unit strained quiet. She stepped through the edge of the puddle, kicked the fallen weapon farther away, then crouched and ripped the radio off his chest rig. The earpiece was still seated in the side of his hood. She took that too. The radio hissed the moment she thumbed it awake, static first, then a burst of clipped speech from somewhere deeper in the unit. "North Service Hall. Check in." The voice was flat, professional, annoyed rather than worried. They had not heard a gunshot, only the brief crack of power in a building already dying by inches. Good. Sarah dragged the body by a shoulder strap just far enough to clear the line of sight from the rear access door, every pull sending knives through her own back and shoulder. His boots left wet half-moons on the floor. She left them. No time to curate the scene. The broken cuff from the main entrance lay in two dull pieces under the red lights. The saline pool was already spreading thinner, losing depth, but the corridor still looked treacherous enough to slow anyone with sense. She put the radio to her ear and listened to another whisper of traffic. 2 men remaining, both holding angles now, both aware one of theirs had gone quiet. Sarah wiped her palm once on the leg of her scrubs and found it slick with sweat and somebody else's blood. Behind her, Brody and the others were still breathing on borrowed current. Ahead of her, the red-lit corridor smelled like scorched air and wet tile, and the first bad decision finally paying interest. Then the radio crackled again, and a second voice, closer than she wanted, asked where the hell Mason had gone. The radio gave her maybe 15 seconds of warning, and none of it was comforting. 2 voices now, one holding the north angle, one shifting closer through the service corridor, both speaking in short, dead pieces because professionals knew panic was loud, and loud got people killed. Sarah backed into the cleaning closet beside the ICU bathrooms with the stolen handset muted against her palm. The space was barely wide enough for a mop sink, shelving, and a rolling caddy loaded with hospital chemicals in white plastic jugs. Then a new smell slipped in through the ventilation grate over the door, dry and peppery at first, almost easy to dismiss, until it found the wet lining of her eyes and turned them to fire. CS gas. Her throat closed hard enough to make her cough before she could stop it. Tears ran hot down her face. Her nose flooded. Every breath scraped. The hunters had learned. They were not coming in blind now. They were going to smoke her out and wait at the mouth of the hole. Sarah bent over the sink, blinking through pain, the stolen radio hissing softly in her pocket. One of the men outside spoke. "Vent run's good. Give it a minute." His voice came through metal and plastic and building bones, still calm. She yanked open the cabinet under the sink and found what she needed by shape before the labels cleared. Housekeeping lived on simple miracles and worse mistakes. Her eyes felt full of ground glass, but the old medic part of her was still moving, still sorting risk by speed and distance, and who was about to suffer first. She grabbed 2 incompatible cleaning solvents from the bottom shelf. She tore the cap off the first with her teeth, spat it into the sink, dumped a hard stream into an empty plastic utility can, then followed with a second. The volatile mixture frothed ugly at once, giving off a white, dirty vapor that hit her even through the last of the CS burn and made her chest recoil. Not subtle, not safe. Fast, though. Fast counted. She grabbed an oxygen mask off a wall hook where environmental services stored backup patient gear for transport, thumbed the tubing onto a portable O2 bottle and cranked it open. Cool flow hissed into the mask. Outside the closet, boots shifted on linoleum. The men were edging closer. expecting her to stumble out half blind and choking. She lifted the chemical can at arm's length, felt the plastic warm slightly in her hand, and gave herself 1 second to decide. Then the radio in her pocket snapped with a voice, asking if the package had eyes on target. No more time. She shoved the mask over her face and shouldered the door open. The corridor took the can, the way dry brush takes a match. She flung it low, not at the men, just into the center of the hall where it bounced once, slopped white froth across the floor, and rolled against the base of the wall vent. Vapor poured out of it in a fast, thick spill, pale at first, then dense enough to turn the red emergency light into something swampy and wrong. The nearest PMC swore and stepped back too late. His hood and suit looked convincing from a distance, but the mask on his face was no real respirator, just a filter shell dressed for theatre. Theatre does not seal. The gas found the gaps instantly. He doubled over with a wet, savage cough that became 3, then 10, shoulders hitching hard. His eyes slammed shut. Tears ran. He clawed at his throat and mask, choking and gagging so hard his whole torso folded around it. His rifle clanged from his hand and spun across the tile. The second man tried to angle away, one forearm coming up across his eyes, but the cloud rolled under and around him, clawing at his face, forcing his chest into panicked shallow pulls that only fed him more of it. He made a raw animal sound and staggered into the wall. The corridor filled with noise then, not gunfire, worse. Choking, blind coughing, boots slipping, metal clattering as another weapon hit the floor. Sarah stood just outside the closet door with the oxygen mask pressed tight, eyes streaming anyway, watching both men come apart in real time as the fake hazmat suits betrayed them. She did not charge them. This was not the kind of victory that invited swagger. She waited 3 seconds until both rifles were down and both men were occupied with the immediate ancient problem of air. One dropped to a knee and clawed at his throat, coughing so hard his whole torso folded around it. The other stumbled backward into a supply cart and knocked basins and wrapped tubing across the floor in a bright, loose crash. Sarah moved through the edge of the cloud where it was thinnest, keeping low, one hand on the mask, the other sweeping the nearest weapon away with her foot. Her own lungs still burned from the first dose of CS, and the backwash now chewing through the hall. It felt like inhaling knives through wet cloth. She kicked the second rifle under the housekeeping rack and backed out before the vapor could close over her. The men were effectively blind now, eyes clamped shut, tears and mucus shining under the red lamps, both reduced to coughing, chest-clutching, desperate bodies. Down in the ICU, the ventilators kept their battery rhythm. Sarah pulled the mask lower just long enough to spit the bitter chemical taste from her mouth, then sealed it back on and listened. No footsteps advancing anymore. No commands. Just ragged coughing, plastic wheels rattling where one man had blundered into the waste cart, and the small music of an ambush turning inside out. The chemical haze was still hanging low in the ICU when the last one came through it. Not stumbling, not coughing, just a big shape with his breath held and his shoulders tucked, driving straight through the white muck like he had decided pain was a problem for later. Sarah saw him too late to do anything smart about it. 1 second she was listening to the 2 downed rifles clatter and the wet choke of ruined lungs. The next, a gloved hand closed on the front of her scrub top and yanked hard enough to lift her half off her feet. He smelled like sweat, trapped under cheap plastic, and the sharp ghost of the gas he had beaten by pure brute timing. She got one look at his eyes through the visor, flat and furious. Then the world turned sideways. He slammed her into the stainless edge of the operating table with enough force to ring the room like a bell. Something inside her right side gave with a dry, cracking pop. Rib. The pain hit a split second later, white and jarring and absolute. She tasted blood before she heard herself breathe again. He did not waste time talking. Good. Talking men made mistakes slower. This one followed the throw-in tight, pinning her against the table with his forearm, while the other hand came up with a knife that looked ugly and workmanlike, the kind made for thrusting into soft places and not being sentimental about it after. Sarah tried to twist, and the broken rib ends scraped somewhere deep, a cold electric agony that made her vision jump. She locked her jaw hard enough to keep the scream inside. Screaming gave people rhythm. She did not want him having any. Around them, the ICU had gone strangely stripped down. Red emergency light, battery hum, chemical stink. The soft animal noise of the two other men still dying by inches in the hall. The leader drove a knee into her thigh to keep her planted and raised the blade. He was too close for her to beat with strength and too heavy to outfight standing up. Fine. She had never needed either one. Her right hand was trapped between them against the table edge, fingers curled around the only thing left there from the procedure chaos. A carbon steel No. 10 scalpel, still slick at the handle from use. Tiny thing. Almost insultingly small in that grip. He shifted to stab downward. That was the opening, not because he got sloppy, but because even good men have to move their shoulder to kill somebody. Shoulders obey anatomy before they obey intent. Sarah let the next breath out in a wet hiss and dropped her weight instead of resisting. It bought her less than an inch. She only needed less than an inch. The knife came down past her face, close enough for the wind of it to brush her cheek. At the same time, she drove the scalpel sideways under his right arm, not blind, not hopeful, exact. The blade slid through the seam where the cheap tactical vest left space for movement. She bypassed the armor entirely, striking deep into the nerve cluster. When the steel found it, his knife arm died in the same instant. Not weakened. Gone. The hand holding the blade opened like it had forgotten itself. The knife dropped, hit the floor, and spun under the tray stand. His shoulder collapsed on that side, arm hanging useless against his ribs like dead meat. For the first time that night, the big man made a real sound. Not anger, fear. Clean, bright, involuntary fear. Sarah did not admire the work. She rammed her palm into his face to create space, nearly blacked out from the rib pain, then kicked straight at the outside of his knee with the heel of her shoe. Not martial arts, not pretty, just leverage in a joint already carrying too much mass. His leg folded sideways with a sick, abrupt buckle, and the rest of him followed it down, slamming onto the tile hard enough to shake the base of the table. He tried to rise with the left side, but the right arm stayed dead, and the knee would not hold. Sarah staggered back a step and had to catch herself on the edge of the operating table before the room could tip over again. Every breath was a problem now. Sharp in, sharper out. Her split lip dripped onto the front of her scrub top. The ICU around her had gone silent in the worst possible way. No shouting, no charge left in the violence, just men on the floor and machines too stubborn to stop. The leader curled around his ruined shoulder and drew air in ragged broken pulls, no longer a hunter, just a body learning what had been taken from it. Sarah looked at him once, then at the blood on the scalpel handle, then at the red-lit room she had turned into a surgical graveyard. She was still standing. Barely. The place was cleared. That would have to count for victory, because her body sure as hell was not offering her anything better. The lights came back all at once, hard fluorescent white flooding the ICU so brutally it made the blood look newly wet. Sarah squinted against it and tightened an arm around her ribs without meaning to. The pain there had settled into something deep and grinding, every breath a reminder that bone had limits, and tonight she had found hers. The room looked worse under honest light. 1 PMC, unconscious in the supply corridor. 2 more collapsed in the aftermath of the gas, 1 barely moving, 1 trying and failing to get his eyes open. The leader crumpled near the operating table, with his right arm hanging useless and his knee folded under him at a shape knees were not built to make. The ventilators kept up their measured labor. Then the main doors slammed open, and a squad of MPS came in fast with weapons up, boots drumming over linoleum, faces set in that blank official way men wear when they think the paperwork is already done. Sterling entered behind them with his cap on, and his expression almost offensively composed. He took in the bodies, the wrecked hall, The blood, the improvised battlefield she had made out of his hospital, and for a second his mouth bent into something close to satisfaction. Not relief. Vindication. "Captain Hayes," he said, voice crisp, carrying easily in the overlit room. "You are under arrest for desertion, theft of military property, and negligent homicide." He said it like he was reading charges off a clean sheet, not stepping over the men he had sent to murder patients. Sarah did not answer. Begging would have cost energy and dignity, and she was low on one, not the other. She stayed where she was by the EMR terminal, leaning one hip into the counter because it hurt less than standing straight. The AP round was still in the tray beside the keyboard. Sterling saw it and moved toward it at once, one gloved hand extending as if everything in the room naturally belonged to him. That, more than the arrest speech, told her what mattered. Not the dead men, not the vents still on battery, the bullet, the proof. Sarah picked it up first. The metal was colder than it should have been after all that heat and blood. She tossed it onto the stainless tray with a sharp clink that cut through the room. Every head turned to the sound. Sterling stopped half a step short. Good. Let him look. Let him know exactly what she had found. Her bloody hand dropped to the keyboard. The screen was already on the audit window she had risked everything to reach. A final prompt waited there like a held breath. She did not look at Sterling when she pressed enter. The key gave with a cheap plastic tap under her fingertip. For one beat, nothing happened. Then the screen refreshed and filled with a single line in clean institutional lettering. HIPAA override federal audit upload complete. Somewhere outside the ICU, alarms started rising. Not the panicked battery chirps of machines. Real sirens. Official ones. Sterling's face changed at last. Not much, just enough. The next door burst was harder than the first. 2 men in plain clothes and body armor came through with badges already out, followed by more agents behind them, CID. They did not waste time asking who had done what. The lead agent looked at the screen, the bullet, the MPS, then at Sterling. "Major Nathan Sterling," he said, tone flat as floor wax. "Step away from the tray and place your hands where I can see them." Sterling laughed once under his breath, a man still trying to negotiate reality. He opened his mouth to cite jurisdiction, but the agent did not bother waiting. He nodded to the pair behind him and they moved in, one catching Sterling's wrist, the other turning him hard enough to break posture and snap cuffs on before the MPs had decided whose side of the law they were standing on. Sterling started to speak again, then saw nobody in the room was coming to rescue his rank. His gaze slid to Sarah, not pleading, not apologizing, just a pure, narrow hatred now that the administrative mask had finally cracked. She met it without interest. Pain had pared her down too far for triumph. Around them, the ICU kept humming, glaring, breathing, indifferent to who was wearing cuffs this minute. The AP round sat in the tray between blood smears and surgical steel like the ugliest little witness in the world. Authority had reversed itself exactly the way it always wanted to, through forms, logs, timestamps, chain of custody. Men loved pretending bullets changed history. Paper did it more often. The CID commander came to Sarah last. That was how institutions showed respect when they did not want to look sentimental about it. He was an older man with a tired face, and the steady posture of a man who had delivered bad news for a living. He looked once at her ribs, once at the screen, once at the bodies, then held out his hand. "Captain, you saved lives," he said. "But you violated 14 federal security regulations. You are no longer a public doctor." He said it without heat and without apology, exactly as the night required. Sarah stared at the ID badge clipped to her torn scrub top, the one with her name and credential and photograph, taken back when the army still pretended it knew what to do with people like her. Her fingers were clumsy from pain. But she got the clip loose. The card felt absurdly light. She dropped it onto the stainless counter, and it landed with a small, cold slap beside the tray. No speech, no appeal. Just the sound of one life ending in the most administrative way possible. The commander took it. Sterling was led out in cuffs. The MPs moved aside as if the room had decided she no longer belonged to them either. Sarah pressed her forearm against her cracked ribs, turned away from the flooded white light, and walked for the dark corridor beyond the ICU. Not vindicated, not clean, not a hero. Just unemployed, injured, and headed toward the only part of the world that still had use for someone who could do the right thing without staying inside the lines.